Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, the show that takes you on a journey to the automotive world. We talk about the latest news, from new makes and models to new technology to all of the must-have options available. Whether you're a fan of the old classics, love the latest models and technology, or have never met a vehicle you didn't want to work on, the GSMC Car Podcast has something for every car enthusiast.
Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, David Lucy Mabel. All right, so today, folks, we are going to be discussing a topic that I am extremely passionate about. Not to say that I'm not extremely passionate about the other topics that we've covered over the course of my time on the GSMC Car Podcast, but this one especially. So we are going to be discussing the best full-size American luxury car of the early 2000s. Now, if you all remember anything that I've told you concerning the cars that I've owned, I have owned almost exclusively GM front-wheel drive luxury cars from the late 90s and early 2000s. With the exception of my 2009 Honda Civic Hybrid that I owned for 4 months, it got totaled in a crash, and I never went back to buying anything import or anything compact or anything hybrid ever again. So I have owned a 1998 Cadillac DeVille, a 1997 Cadillac DeVille, and a 2004 Buick Park Avenue Ultra. So these are the cars that I am the most familiar with, this GM K-body and G-body sort of stuff, front-wheel drive, large, heavy vehicles. So, there was this man on one of the car groups that I belong to on Facebook that put a posting in Unpopular Car Opinions, which is basically a place where you can post your unpopular opinions about cars, and then, of course, people may agree with you or people may roast you for having an unpopular opinion. It's much fun. But what he did, and what sparked me to do this, is that he said in the post that read, "The best full-size American luxury sedan of the early 2000s is the Cadillac DeVille. And they're better than the town car in almost every way except reliability, and they fixed that after 2004. Also, the town car is hideous." Unquote. That's what he said. Now, you could imagine how, the comment section would have blown up as a result of this posting. Because here we are in retrospect, 20 years after the 8th generation DeVille was launched, or really 21 years now, because the first model year of the 8th generation DeVille was 2000. So here we are 21 years later after these cars came out, and we can see now which one was actually the better vehicle. And in terms of reliability, the town car won, hands down. Town cars go 4, 5, 600,000 miles on just regular maintenance. A DeVille of that time period with a North Star engine, which all of them had North Star engines, you would be lucky to get 150,000 miles out of it before it started giving you problems. And so here's the sort of debate we've got going on here. Which one is the better car? Because if you're talking about reliability, then we know what the answer. But if you're talking about comfort, then it kind of, there's a kind of gray area there. So that's what sparked me to do this podcast. I have great interest in this because, these are the cars that I know more about, or I know most about, and this is what I am passionate about. And not only that, I have this platform of this podcast so I can settle this debate once and for all. And of course, I couldn't stop commenting on the post. Every time somebody had mentioned something, I had to reply. I had to offer my 2 cents. I probably put like 7 to 10 comments underneath this post in a post that probably had like 40 comments. So I probably did a quarter of the comments, let's be honest. But anyway, this sparked a great interest. So yeah, anyway, let me move on. We looked at 2 cars first. Or we will look at these 2 cars first. We will talk about them objectively in terms of specifications and, mathematics on paper, what they're like. And then we will talk about them subjectively, meaning how do they feel, what is people's popular opinions of them, sort of handling how they drive, build quality sort of things. Then I'll tell you which ones were mentioned that really don't compare, and which one that beats them both. So what I mean by which ones I mentioned that really don't compare, somebody mentioned the Chrysler 300. Later on in the podcast, in segment 3, I believe, you'll find out why the Chrysler 300 doesn't compare. And you'll also figure out in segment 3 which one that I propose is the best full-size American luxury car of the early 2000s that beats both the Lincoln Town Car and the Cadillac DeVille. And in segment 4, you'll find out why, in fact, this is not actually a very fair comparison, because there's another car from Lincoln that actually competed directly against the DeVille, and it was not a coincidence that it was configured the way that it was. But you'll also end up finding that out later. So let's start for the rest of segment 1 with the Lincoln Town Car. So, the Lincoln Town Car was produced from 1981 to 2011. Since this is the early 2000s we're speaking of, we will focus on the 3rd generation of the Town Car that ran from 1998 to 2011. So, objectively speaking, the Town Car was built on Ford's rear-wheel drive Panther platform that had been used since the 1970s. This Panther platform was it holds a record for one of the most common platforms ever used in automotive history. I mean, you've got things like the Volkswagen Beetle, the GM B-Body, the Ford Panther platform, and then there was another one too, goodness, or the Ford Model T, obviously. Those platforms are probably the most produced platforms of any automotive platform in American car history. Besides, obviously the Volkswagen Beetle is not an American car. But as far as American cars go, you got the Model T, the Panther platform, and the B-Body are some of the most produced cars in the world and in America, until they discontinue them, that is. But even then, they're still more common than any of the new cars you're going to get nowadays because they had been around for so long. And get this. The engine was a 4.6-liter modular single overhead cam V8. Now, what a single overhead cam is basically over each cylinder bank, there's one camshaft. That camshaft does the job of opening up the exhaust and the intake valves. Whereas some other engines, it's dual overhead cam, and then I'll talk about that when I get to the Cadillac, because that's what the Cadillac had. At its heaviest, it weighed 4,369 pounds. So this was a heavy car. And the transmission was a 4-speed automatic driving the rear wheels. Power output. In 2003, the final power increase in the Town Car would come with 224 horsepower in the lower trim, Signature, and the Fleet Executive model, and 239 horsepower in the higher trim Cartier. The engine produced 235 or 239 pound-feet of torque at 4,100 RPM, and it did 0 to 60 in 9.4 seconds. So now you can see that the Town Car, on paper, is rather lackluster. I mean, it's a large American body-on-frame construction boat that cruised. It is not a speed demon. Granted, they have a highly modifiable engine, so you could make this into a speed demon if you were willing to change suspension components, maybe put a manual transmission, do a bunch of other foolishness, which I've seen it done before. And those, I commend that, but I don't know if I have the willpower to put that much money into a car to make a car fast that was never supposed to be fast to begin with. The Town Car is not a performer. The Town Car, it pulls, it cruises, and it's reliable. I've seen these things towing trailers. I've seen these things, cruising, eating up highway miles. That's what these cars are meant for. They're meant for being comfortable, floaty, very simple to work on, and fairly luxurious. We're not talking about Mercedes-Benz S-Class level of luxury here, but then again, it's a lot cheaper and it's a lot more old-fashioned than that. It's just supposed to be, a proper car with no frills besides the obvious, luxury frills. No frills as far as engineering goes. There was nothing special in the engineering of this car. It was engineered the exact same way as the Mercury Grand Marquis and the Ford Crown Victoria. The only thing that was different with this one, it had a, different body and more luxury trimmings. Other than that, everything else was very simple to work on. So that's what the town car was. But now let's speak of it subjectively. What are people saying about these cars? What is the popular opinion surrounding the town car of this time period? So, subjectively speaking, the town car is old-fashioned. More so than any other American luxury sedan offered at the same time. Because you think that the other American luxury sedans, GM had gotten rid of their body-on-frame rear-wheel drive cars since 1996. And then Chrysler had probably done that since the 70s or the 80s. Chrysler had gotten into the K cars. Chrysler was done with full-size American luxury sedans a long time before this. So really, the two powerhouses in the full-size luxury sedan world were GM and Ford. Ford made the Lincoln Town Car and the Mercury Grand Marquis. And then GM, before the 2000s, had stopped making the Cadillac Fleetwood and the Buick Roadmaster, which were body-on-frame construction cars, big, heavy V8 in the front, driving the rear wheels. So that's how it was. That's how it was. So by the time that GM had discontinued this, really the Lincoln and the Ford and the Mercury and the other ones that are built on the Ford platform, there was some Hongqi over in China that was a rebadged version of this that used the Panther platform. What had happened was that it was the only one of its breed left. And then you'll hear this in my podcast way long time ago. I probably did this back in September of 2020 about the life and the death of the traditional American luxury sedan. And I definitely mentioned the Ford Panther platform going out of production in 2011. So it's built on the antiquated Panther platform that had been in use since the 70s, like I said earlier. It still used the old method of body-on-frame to construct the car, and this causes the car not to be as nimble as its competitors, and it didn't even offer such modern conveniences as side airbags. Ironically, even though these cars did not have side airbags, Ford made up for that fact with seat-mounted airbags. And as a result, it was the first production sedan to earn 5-star safety ratings in every single category. And I've got a mother of a friend of mine that can attest to the safety of a Lincoln Town Car. She had a 1998 Lincoln Town Car. She was T-boned by a truck. And while she was pregnant, T-boned by a truck while she was pregnant, and she walked away. Walked away with only a couple of bruises. The car was totaled, obviously, but it kept her safe. I can't speak to any other American car that I know of that would have been able to save someone and their unborn child from being T-boned by a truck and them walking away. These cars were extremely safe because they were just so overbuilt in every way, shape, or form. These cars were built, this platform at least, was built for police officer use, for taxi use, knowing how those cars that are used in police fleets and taxi fleets are put to the test every single day and abused for sometimes decades, and they still run. I heard while I was doing research for this that a common life expectancy for a fleet version of the Lincoln Town Car, which was the executive trim, was 400,000 miles. That was the life expectancy when a fleet bought it. So you got 400,000 miles out of one of these things, goodness. And it kept you safe the entire time. This is one of, if not the best car that America has ever produced. But now, how does it compare to actually being a luxury car? Because right now, the way I'm describing it, it just sounds like a fancied up Ford Crown Victoria. But really, that's what it is. It's not a luxury car in the truest sense that it was designed from the bottom up to be a luxury car. That's not what it was designed for. It was designed from the bottom up to be a robust four-door sedan that ended up getting luxury trimmings, in which it classified as a luxury car, but it was not born as a luxury car. It was born as a robust sedan platform way back in the 70s, and then as things got, they progressed, then it became a luxury car after cost-cutting measures happened, and then Lincoln couldn't continue to make unique platforms under their Continental nameplate, so they ended up using the same platform as Ford, blah, 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 and then they end up having the Lincoln Town Car as a result. The Continental that came before this used a unique platform. Continentals were not built on the Ford Panther platform. I'm talking about Continentals like back in the 60s, before this thing became even a thing. The thing is, they had to do cost-cutting measures, thus having Lincoln share platforms with the rest of the Ford family. So the Panther platform, as a result, was not designed from the ground up to be a luxury vehicle. It just happened to be underpinning a luxury vehicle because it was good enough for it. And not only was it good enough for it, it was also very robust and it was able to be upgraded. So now, back to what my notes say. By the time the Lincoln Town Car died in 2011, it was the last wholly traditional American luxury sedan. By wholly, I don't mean like holy, holy, holy. I mean like wholly in its entirety. It's entirely traditional American luxury sedan. The one before that, like I mentioned, was a Cadillac Fleetwood that disappeared 15 years earlier in 1996. The Town Car was not fast, but it was extremely reliable and very easy to fix. It is still a staple in fleets across the country, even 10 years later in 2021 after its discontinuation. So there you have it. That's the lowdown on the Lincoln Town Car. In the next segment, we are going to be discussing the Cadillac DeVille of the time period, in which in recent years, the Cadillac DeVille in the car enthusiast world has become sort of a controversial figure, and you'll find out why in the next segment. So please stay tuned, folks.
Are you a business owner? Someone interested in the latest news that might affect your business? Then check out the GSMC Business News Podcast, a show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. The GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
All right. Hello, folks. So here we are. We discussed the Lincoln Town Car and all of its engineering, all of its subjectiveness, all of its objectiveness. We discussed it in such a way that really someone can get a full picture of what the Lincoln Town Car was. We're going to do the same thing now with the Cadillac DeVille. So the Cadillac DeVille was produced from 1959 to 2005, so a very long run, even longer than the Lincoln Town Car. And because this is the early 2000s we're speaking of, we're going to be focusing on the eighth and final generation of the Cadillac DeVille that was produced from 2000 to 2005. Objectively speaking, now let me get into this. Let me just flip my page here. It was built on GM's front-wheel drive G platform, and the engine was a 4.6-liter Northstar V8. Remember that. That is a very important piece of this car. The transmission was a 4-speed automatic transmission driving the front wheels. It was 3,800 pounds as far as weight goes, so considerably lighter than a Lincoln Town Car. It had a power output of 275 horsepower in the base and the DHS models, and 300 horsepower in the DTS models. In 2005, however, the DTS got a power decrease to 290 horsepower. So that's just a tidbit for you all there. And it did 0 to 60, the DTS model, that is, in 7 seconds, and I believe the base models did 0 to 60 in 7.9 seconds, because I own one of these from the 90s, which was basically the same car as the ones in the 2000s, just a different body. And subjectively speaking, however, the DeVille is a lot more modern in its entire philosophy compared to the Town Car. It is lighter, sportier, and more powerful. The DeVille is a unibody construction with a very robust frame. It handles relatively well despite its large size, and is not afraid of speed, though it knows how to cruise very well. It came with or had available such modern conveniences as night vision, which, by the way, night vision on these cars, this was the first production car in the world to have automotive night vision. It was an infrared camera, essentially, that was mounted behind the grille, and then that would see what was in front of you and project an image onto your windshield in like a heads-up display. So in places where it was very dark, and let's say your headlights couldn't go as far, you could still see what was in front of you through the infrared projection onto your windscreen. That's how the night vision worked in these cars, which is a very, 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 very ahead of its time feature. And it didn't come back after they discontinued it in 2004 until the most recent iteration of the Cadillac Escalade, which uses the same principle, but it's done in a different way in the Cadillac Escalade. The DHS came equipped with power rear sunshades, heated and massaging rear seats. The DTS had stability control and other features that accentuated its sporty nature. Now, let me talk about the Cadillac DeVille as far as its luxuriousness goes before I get into the engine, because I just read those off of my notes. So let me comment now. These cars were extremely elegant and very well built. As far as interior, as far as build quality goes, body and everything. My brother has owned 2 Cadillac DeVilles from this time period. His first, well, both of them have been 2002s. His first car was a 2002 Cadillac DeVille, and it ended up dying. So there was at a time we had 2 2002 Cadillac DeVilles. There was the one that my brother was driving, and then the one that we had that was a spare car that we had originally bought as a parts car for my brother's car, but then it was fixed up to act as a spare car. Well, when my brother's transmission in his Cadillac went out, and it wasn't even really the transmission, it was a transmission shift solenoid that went out. So the transmission shift solenoid had gone out. In order for it to have been changed, the engine would have had to be dropped, transmission would have had to be undone, and then fix the shift solenoid, put everything back together, put the engine back in the car. Really, the part itself wasn't very expensive. It's just with the labor costing so much money to do all of that, the car wasn't worth it, especially at over 150,000 miles. So we just decided to junk it, and the rest of the car was falling apart anyway. So my brother ended up coming back home, getting the spare Cadillac, and then taking it back to school with him in Miami. So now he's driving what used to be our spare car. Now, these cars are so well built, robustly built, and I'm not talking about interior quality per se. Interior quality, it's cheap late 90s, early 2000s GM. But the Town Car wasn't much better in the interior anyway. So we're talking about American luxury cars of this time period. Interior is not where they shine. But as far as the exterior goes, the body of these cars, they are very well built, very robust. What many people do not know about the G platform of GM, the G platform, in many ways, was even more robust than the B body that served as the full-size sedan before the G platform became the popularized one. The G platform, when it was being tested, needed to undergo a frame-crushing machine in order to test the strength of the frame. Well, when GM was testing this, the regular frame-crushing machine that they used for cars, when they tried to test it on the G platform, it broke the machine before the frame was finally buckled. So that GM had to use a truck frame crusher in order to finally get the frame to buckle under its own weight, under the pressure that it was being subjected to. If that isn't build quality, folks, I don't know what is. A lot of purists are like, body on frame construction, blah, 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 that's the best. It's built like a truck, nah, nah, nah. It's good in some ways. But when you have a unibody that is just as good, if not better than the body on frame construction, you have to get to a point where you have to give up the argument. Because cars have been using unibody construction since probably the 30s in some European cars, and it probably became more popular in America in the 50s, and probably became a staple in America probably in the 80s, unibody construction. There have been cars such as the Continentals like the 58, the 59, and the 60 Continental were all unibody, one of the largest unibody cars ever made. Some Imperials were unibody, and then they went back to body on frame, and then they eventually went back to unibody again. And then there's a lot of, American cars that do the flip from unibody to the body on frame, from unibody to body on frame, specifically the large luxury cars. But when you get a frame that is as robust as the GM platform, that's basically the culmination of what a unibody should be. It took a truck frame crusher to crush this frame when they were testing it. So I don't want to hear anybody saying, it's unibody. Unibody's not that. Unibody offers better performance, a lightweight car, and better handling. Unibody is the way to go. I love my body on frame construction vehicles because I like a car that's easy to fix and that is luxurious. So in my own philosophy, I would rather have a body on frame construction vehicle. But knowing that the last body on frame construction Cadillac that wasn't an SUV, that was a sedan, was produced 25 years ago, it's highly unlikely that I'm going to end up owning one of those vehicles. Because, just a little tidbit, I am starting a new job, and I am looking to get a new car. And after much research and much debate, because I'm absolutely just anal about searching for cars and what is the best, bang for my buck, what's the best car that I can get and what car still expresses my style. I really wanted a Cadillac DeVille Fleetwood. Or not a Cadillac DeVille Fleetwood, those don't exist. A Cadillac Fleetwood. Or I saw even a Cadillac Fleetwood Limited that was built on a stretched DeVille platform in 98 and 99. But after owning my car, and the fact that it's an aging GM product, I told myself I really couldn't bring myself to do it. For the simple fact that I needed a car that was a more modern design and a more modern construction in which parts were going to be easier to find. Because I could own two aging GM products that are very reliable until a plastic tube breaks. And then you have to wait 2 days before you order one from the dealer because it's a dealer-only item. That's happened to me before on my Buick Park Avenue Ultra. The supercharger bypass valve broke while my car was getting a normal tune-up, and they were changing vacuum lines and whatnot. The plastic had gotten so brittle after like 16 years, the car was 16 at the time, that it just disintegrated. And I had to look for ages before I finally found one of those. And not only that, I was home from college at the time. So I had to go back to work, I had to go back to class, but I ended up missing a day of work and missing a day of class because I couldn't find the part and my car couldn't be put back together for me to go back for me to take the highway to go back to school. So after that experience, and not only that experience, but some other experiences in which these parts are no longer available for these cars because the car was engineered back in 1996. So it was already a very old design by my car being built in late 2003 as a 2004 model. I was like, I can't go back and own another aging GM product, but I digress. So now let's talk about the North Star engine in the Cadillac before I go on another rant, because I've decided to buy a more modern vehicle. The North Star engine was a fragile construction. It had It was made completely of aluminum. Head and block and all was aluminum. It had dual overhead camshaft design. It had performance potential, but the engine was prone to head gasket failure that usually resulted from repeated overheatings, and that caused the aluminum metal to get soft, and the head bolts that kept the heads to the block of the engine would eventually strip and then get a space in between the engine block and the head that allowed the head gasket to let coolant escape into the oil mixture of the car, thus basically grenading your engine. I have to pause because I love these Cadillac DeVilles so much, but my God, am I ever going to stop complaining about the North Star engine? I don't think I ever will. I'll be complaining about the North Star engine when I'm 80 years old and they haven't been in production for like 70 years. That's when I'll stop complaining. I'll still be complaining about the North Star engine then. I don't think I'll ever stop complaining about it. I'll be complaining about it when everybody alive on the earth that's worth their salt won't even know what a North Star engine is, because that's how old it would have been by the time I finally stopped complaining about it. That's just to put it into perspective. The North Star engine is just, it's a feat of engineering, but it's a disaster as far as reliability goes. Now, I tend to defend the North Star engine because we've had 4, and none of them have given us this fabled head gasket failure. But I would be remiss to say if all 4 of our North Stars didn't overheat at some point. All of them did. I would be remiss to say if all 4 of our North Stars didn't leak oil. They all did. I would be remiss to say if all 4 of our North Stars didn't consume oil. They all did. I had a North Star that the camshaft broke. And why did the camshaft break? The camshaft is supposed to last the life of the vehicle, is it not? Yes, it is. But when you have a North Star in which the water pump pulley is driven off of the front camshaft, your water pump pulley may seize because of lack of lubrication or whatnot. The water pump pulley seized in my 1997 Cadillac DeVille, and it caused the water pump not only to go, but it snapped the camshaft at the point where it jutted out of the engine to run the water pump pulley. So now my car says engine hot, turning off car. First time my poor Cadillac had ever overheated. And I pull over to the side of the road, thankfully, in front of a mechanic shop. And then I back it in because I'm late on my first day to class for my Wednesday class, sophomore year of college. So I texted my group chat with some of my friends that I had at the time. I told them, hey, my car broke down. Can somebody pick me up and give me a ride to class? So God bless him. My friend John Daniel came to come and pick me up, and he took me to class. And then the next day, after I had dropped it off at the mechanic, I had told the mechanic, hey, I think it's the water pump. It's a pretty common problem on those cars. Tell me how much it's going to be to fix, and then I'll get it done. He's like, yeah, you need a new water pump. It's going to be about $443. I was like, okay, yeah, go ahead and do it. That was a Thursday. Friday morning, he called to me. He's like, hey, you're the owner of the Cadillac, right? I was like, yes. And he's like, actually, I took a closer look at the car. He's like, your water pump is actually fine. You need a new camshaft because the water pump pulley broke the camshaft. And I said, what? And I immediately freaked out because I was like, I need a new car. He's like, yeah, it's going to be about $1,500 to fix. And my Cadillac DeVille at this time was worth $800 on a good day. So considering that it's about double the value of my car, I had to get a new car. That's just the plight of the North Star engine. But I still end up loving the North Stars nonetheless because of how well they perform when they are sorted out. You get a good North Star engine that has been maintained, that has been taken care of, that's not overheating, that's not burning oil, that's not burning coolant, that's not doing any of this North Star foolishness. And my God, for the money at the time period and for what it was, this was one of the best performing engines coming out of Detroit. It was smooth. It was powerful. It sounded amazing, but it was somehow quiet at the same time. This was a super luxurious experience to drive a North Star. And the thing is, they weren't afraid of being driven hard. And for being a naturally aspirated vehicle, for a naturally aspirated engine, this thing had so much pep at higher speeds. I can remember from 70 to 90, I would put my foot down in my Cadillac DeVille, and it would just go, no complaining. From 90 to 100, it would just go. I better not speak too loud because then my family will know I've been breaking 100 in my Cadillacs. But anyway, from 90 to 100, you put your foot down, this thing just went with no hesitation. And coupled with that 4T80 transmission from GM that was bulletproof, really, coupled with the fact that it could handle the North Star speed. The only thing on the car that couldn't handle the North Star's power were the engine mounts. And honestly, in the grand scheme of things, that's rather inconsequential. So now, here we are. We have a wonderful vehicle, but with the fault of its engine that is horribly unreliable. That's the downside of the 2000 to 2005 Cadillac DeVille. And that's why so many people in retrospect have grown to hate these cars. And even me, after my last North Star, I was tempted to get another one. Believe me, goodness, I was tempted to get another one, but I told myself no. I was like, I'm a college student. I need this car to last me through college without it giving me a several $1,000s problem again. So I ended up buying what I believe is the best American luxury sedan of the early 2000s. But you'll find out about that in segment 3. So stay tuned, folks.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
All right, so welcome back, folks. We've discussed the Cadillac DeVille in the last segment, specifically the 2000 to 2005 Cadillac DeVille. Now we're in segment 3. Now I'm going to talk to you about the one car that somebody mentioned that really didn't fit as far as being compared to these cars, and the Buick Park Avenue Ultra, which I believe is the best American luxury sedan that you could have bought in the early 2000s. So the first car, the car that I have to mention that doesn't fit into this mix. And let me pull up the comment that someone said. And I don't mean, the thing is, I don't mean to hate on people, because obviously this is an unpopular car opinion. But someone said something that I just had to laugh at. And let me find it real quick. Don't mind me, folks. Scrolling through these Facebook things, honestly, goodness. There it is. Okay. So, the guy was like, are we all just going to ignore the Chrysler 300, by the way, got to 60 in under 8 seconds, and it was rear-wheel drive. To which I respond, Chrysler, ha 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 ha. I was like, dang, don't even bring them into this mix. Plus, the Chrysler 300 is not a traditional American luxury car like the DeVille or the Town Car. It would be more fair to compare the 300 to the Cadillac STS and the Lincoln MKS. And then someone who wasn't even part of this original conversation came through and said, no, the 300 is comparable to a Town Car, and the DeVille is comparable to what I just left in my toilet. All right. So I'm here to debunk this. And this, I love these posts because they give me fuel for my podcasts. Because honestly, sometimes, when you're doing the podcast, you can get writer's block. And not writer's block in the sense that you're writing a story and you don't know what to write next. You can get podcast block, if I could put it that way. You have done just about everything under the sun, and then you're like, what am I going to do the next podcast on? And then I'm scrolling through Facebook, and I see this foolishness. I was like, oh, this is going to be a good podcast. So anyway, now, he mentioned the Chrysler 300. And I have to say, I laughed at the mere mention of that because it's a Chrysler product. Like I keep on saying, Chrysler hasn't made anything good since the Imperial. And the Imperial in its traditional form before it became a K-car monstrosity was discontinued in the 1970s, I believe. So since the 70s, for the past 40 to 50 years, God gracious my land, for almost half a century, Chrysler hasn't produced anything worth its salt. Everything has had a problem or another, be it reliability, be it build quality, the fact that it's antiquated. The 300 that is still on the roads today was engineered in like 2010, which by car standards is so old. Chrysler has 2 models left, folks. 2 models left. They've got a minivan that they have 3 different versions of, and they've got the Chrysler 300. This is a tragedy. Someone has the audacity to mention Chrysler when you're talking about Cadillac and Lincoln. You couldn't even mention Chrysler when you were talking about Cadillac and Lincoln back in the 70s when they were making the Imperial, because the Continental and the Fleetwood were objectively the better vehicles, even in the terms of the Imperial. So Chrysler hasn't been able to hold a candle to Lincoln or Cadillac probably since the 50s. And here's someone mentioning a Chrysler 300 when talking about the Lincoln Town Car and the Cadillac DeVille. Lord help me. I just had to laugh. But anyway, so he's like, oh, well, it's comparable to a Town Car, the other guy said. And I say, here's what I say to that. The Chrysler 300 is not built with the same philosophy as the Town Car and the Cadillac DeVille. Here's what I mean, because I studied philosophy when I was in college. I had a minor in philosophy. And so naturally, whenever I look at the world, I will always have a philosophical bent wherever I see something. I always see the philosophy in something. And here's my philosophy. What has happened with the Cadillac DeVille and the Lincoln Town Car? You need to understand some history. It all goes back to the oil crisis of 1973. And by gosh, oh my land, if I could have 5 podcasts in which I don't mention the oil crisis, somebody better pay me. Because I don't think I can go 5 podcasts without mentioning the oil crisis at some point. Because the oil crisis was such a huge turning point in American car culture. So I'm going to give you a quick recap as to why the oil crisis is even relevant 30-something years after it happened in the early 2000s. And here's why. The Lincoln Town Car was a holdout from the era of the oil crisis. Because like I said, the Continental before it was much larger, built on a much heavier, more robust platform. We're talking about these Continentals weighed like 5,000 pounds. So the Panther platform was actually a downsized version. The Panther platform was a downsized version that was more modern than whatever platform came before it. and that was more fuel efficient and frankly was more versatile because they didn't only just use it in Lincoln, they used it in not Cadillac. Oh, God forbid they used it in Cadillac. Goodness, that's not wrong. That's not right. They used it in Lincoln, Mercury, and Ford. They built everything from coupes to station wagons to sedans on the Ford Panther platform from the 70s and onward. So it was a downsized platform. Downsized in order for it to be more fuel efficient. But even then, it still used the same construction method, just on a smaller scale. So that car was sort of a half-hearted attempt at Ford to try to keep the other cars, try to keep their traditional cars in production through the era of the oil crisis in which gas was very expensive and then American cars were facing a tipping point in their history. Okay, so that's the Ford Panther platform. The G-body from Cadillac traces its days back to the oil crisis as well. Because when Cadillac saw the oil crisis, not to say that Cadillac didn't continue to produce the traditional rear-wheel drive luxury sedans. They did that too, with the downsized version of their previous full-size luxury sedan platform, which was the B-body. The B-body was a downsized version of the one that came before it. So now the B-body, being the downsized car that it was, ended up fulfilling the same function as the Panther platform. But at the same time, in the 70s, they were producing rear-wheel drive cars. Into the 80s, they started producing front-wheel drive unibody luxury sedans while still keeping their traditional sedans in the back row for anybody who wanted them. So Cadillac was producing the Fleetwood up until 96, and Lincoln was producing the town car on the Panther body because it's confusing with Lincoln. And bear with me if you're confused because I'm also kind of confused. Because the town car was once a trim of the Continental. But then the town car became its own model in 1981. And that's when the town car was built on the Panther platform. The Continental before was never built on the Panther platform, to my understanding at least. So in 1981, the town car became the Panther platform version, or became the Lincoln version of the Panther platform. Along with the Mercury, I think, Grand Marquis, I don't know what it was called at the time. It could have been the Colony Park. The Colony Park was a station wagon, and the Ford LTD Crown Victoria. So now that you've got this, where does Chrysler fall in the mix? Chrysler got rid of their full-size rear-wheel drive platform back in the 70s as well. However, because Chrysler never sold as much as Lincoln and Cadillac, they never came out with a downsized version of it. Chrysler began to go to the economy route because the full-size rear-wheel drive luxury cars that Cadillac and Lincoln had were not economical. They were slightly better than the ones that came before, but they were not economical by any stretch of the imagination. Chrysler went the economy route, and Chrysler was also facing lots of financial issues at this time period. So Chrysler ended up having the K car introduced in the 80s. That's where Chrysler's luxury sedans went. They went to unibody front-wheel drive cars. So the Imperial that was built on the K platform in Chrysler, not the K platform in GM, because that was another car. The K platform in Chrysler was a unibody front-wheel drive car driven by a Mitsubishi V6. That was the last time Chrysler ever did anything. It was before that, actually, that Chrysler did anything as far as large V8 rear-wheel drive body-on-frame luxury sedan. Now, you would say, well, didn't the Chrysler 300 come with a V8? Yes, it did. But here's the difference between the Chrysler 300 and the Chrysler Imperial that came before it way back in the 70s that was a body-on-frame rear-wheel drive sedan. The Chrysler 300 was built under the philosophy of targeting the German cars because after the oil crisis came, in the 1980s, seeing that the Americans were still floundering to produce anything economical, even though Cadillac and Lincoln were producing body-on-frame cars, still, they were obviously not economical. And even though they had started gradually moving to unibody front-wheel drive cars, the cars were still not economical because they still had the very old-fashioned mindset. So the German cars, seeing the shortcomings of the American cars, not only were they shortcoming as far as their engineering goes, they had to offer them at lower prices so that more people could buy them so that they could make more of a profit margin. So they had to start making the cars cheaper. People who wanted real luxury were no longer looking to the American car companies at this point. They were looking at the German car companies. Germany comes in with the likes of the S-Class. The likes of the S-Class, which is known the world over as being extremely robustly built, very good, very sporty as far as, compared to the American cars. It came in and completely blew American luxury sedans out of the water. And when you were an executive who a decade earlier would have strived to buy a Cadillac, now you're striving to buy a Mercedes-Benz because Cadillac was cheap and the people who work under you can afford that now. So you didn't want a Cadillac anymore. You were striving to own a Mercedes-Benz or a BMW because those were the new, hot-off-the-press cars that were making their debut in the United States. So now, where does the Chrysler 300? I'm going to get back to you on the Chrysler 300. Where does it fit into this mix? If you all can recall, from 1998 to, I believe, 2009, there was a merger between Chrysler and Mercedes-Benz called Daimler-Chrysler. What resulted of the Daimler-Chrysler era? The 300. The Chrysler 300. Because in Chrysler's mind, it's financially struggling. The Germans have a foothold in America now with their luxury cars. If you can't beat them, might as well join them. That's what Chrysler did. Cadillac came out with the Seville. The Seville, the Seville had already existed, but the Seville, from the time it was introduced in the 70s into the 80s, it was squarely targeted at beating the Germans. Lincoln, on the other hand, had the Continental that was now a front-wheel drive car and body, unibody construction. But the Continental, Lincoln only ever made a half-hearted attempt to beat the Germans because Lincoln was like, Cadillac can focus on the Germans. We're going to focus on us American people. So they continued with their rear-wheel drive and gave that paramount. That was their flagship. The town car was still the flagship Lincoln at the time. Whereas Cadillac restructured the way it saw of its sedans, the smallest one, which was the Seville, was the most luxurious and the most capable of beating the Germans. So now Chrysler was scrambling. Chrysler was like, I don't know what to do. I don't have money to create my own car. I'm going to merge with the Germans and see what they give me. They give Chrysler the 300. Thus why the 300 has no place to be spoken of with the DeVille and the town car, because the 300 is not a traditional American luxury sedan. It has come as a result of a merger with the Germans that the Americans have been trying to beat since they took over the luxury car market in the 1980s. If we were going to compare a traditional American luxury sedan from Chrysler in the 2000s, we probably would have had to consider the LHS, the Concorde, whatever it was called, one of those cab-forward vehicles. Because it was front-wheel drive, still very much built in the American sense. Front-wheel drive, larger displacement engine, and then comfortable, roomy cabin handled like a boat. That was probably the one that they should have compared it to. The Chrysler 300 is not a car like that. Lincoln didn't finally start trying to combat the Germans for real until the Lincoln LS. Cadillac had been doing it with the Seville, and then the Seville eventually evolved into the STS. And then Chrysler had done it with the Chrysler 300, which was successful in its own right for what it was trying to do, but it was not a traditional American luxury sedan. So now that I spent almost the entire segment discussing what was only supposed to be part one, let me go to you now as to why the Buick Park Avenue is the best American luxury sedan from the early 2000s. So, I've already explained all of that foolishness about why the Chrysler 300 doesn't compare. Those cars, the 300, the STS, and the Lincoln LS, they all deserve a podcast on their own. And you know what? That might actually be my next podcast. Don't take that. Take that with a grain of salt. I don't know. Unless there's something else interesting pops up, I will probably do a podcast on that. So now, here's the Buick Park Avenue Ultra. Someone said that I had, quote, won the post by mentioning the Buick Park Avenue Ultra. Upon asking why, he said because it ticks all the boxes. And here's why. The Park Avenue Ultra was the top-of-the-line Buick sedan. It had all the comfort of a Cadillac without the maintenance costs. And the Buick 3800 engine is known as one of the most reliable American engines ever made. The supercharger brought power output to 240 horsepower and 280 pound-feet of torque, which satisfied the performance craving of the market at the time. The Cadillac DeVille, being a traditional American luxury sedan, was more of a neo-traditional American luxury sedan, but you'll find out why I say that in segment 4, just as a refresher onto my podcast of the life and the death of the traditional American luxury sedan. So, the Buick Park Avenue Ultra was really the best of both worlds. It was very robustly built because it was also built on the G platform, just like the Cadillac. But it had the Buick 3800 engine. The Buick 3800 engine had been in development since the 1960s. It was a cast iron camshaft, in the center of the block, pushing push rods to open up the valves. So it was a push rod engine, cast iron block, very, very, very robustly built and well made. In fact, it started life as a V8 in which it chopped off 2 cylinders. And, fun fact, the Buick 3800 engine shares a common lineage with the Rover V8. Because after GM had taken the V8 that the 3800 would be based off of, they sold the design of the original V8 to Rover in England, and then that ended up becoming the Rover V8, which was also an extremely reliable engine. So the Buick 3800, as a V6, had been in production in some way, shape, or form, the Buick V6, since 1962. It finally reached, 3800, which was its final displacement, probably in the late 80s, early 90s. There was a Series 1, and the one that we're discussing in this podcast is the Series 2. In the 1997 to 2005 Buick Park Avenue. So now, that being said, the Buick Park Avenue, with this very robust engine, still performed better than the Lincoln Town Car because it was a unibody construction vehicle, even though the Lincoln Town Car produced just about the same amount of power. But the Park Avenue, being lighter and due to its construction, produced more torque. It produced about 40 pound-feet of torque more than the Lincoln Town Car. But because it's a GM product, and it was basically the Cadillac of Buicks, it was more luxurious than the Lincoln Town Car, which really, for its entire history, has just been nothing but a fancy Ford Crown Victoria. If you got a well-equipped Ford Crown Victoria, it was comparable to a town car. You could not get a well-equipped Chevy Impala that was comparable to a Buick Park Avenue Ultra. You just couldn't. That's not how GM structured themselves. Ford made the mistake of making the town car too similar to the Crown Victoria, in which if you had a really well-equipped Crown Victoria, you didn't even need a town car. Or if you had a really well-equipped Mercury Grand Marquis, you didn't need a town car. Because there was not that great of a difference amongst the three versions of the Panther platform. the Buick Park Avenue wins in reliability, in luxury, and in performance. Because even though it didn't perform as well as the Cadillac, it could perform much longer than the Cadillac. Because the Cadillac, after about 100,000 miles, if you didn't put some serious work into that engine, into keeping it afloat, after about 100 to 150,000 miles, the car would start giving you problems. Just to put it into perspective, my camshaft broke at 110,000 miles in my Cadillac DeVille. So, at that point, it wasn't even worth mentioning the DeVille when the Buick Park Avenue Ultra came out. What I will say, just like I said in my podcast way at the beginning of my career here, in which I've titled it Cadillac, What Happened? I will say Cadillac made a mistake. And Cadillac did not offer the Buick 3800 engine in the Cadillac, even as a base model. They never did it. And I think Cadillac is still reeling from that decision. I don't think GM executives ever thought of doing that, but me as a consumer and as a subsequent reviewer of these vehicles, the DeVille base model would have benefited a lot from a 3800. But nonetheless, the past is past now. It's gone. It's done. We don't have anything to say about that anymore. So there you have it. This is why I believe the Buick Park Avenue Ultra is the best American luxury sedan from the early 2000s. So please stay tuned for segment 4, in which I'm going to tell you why this whole entire comparison between the Town Car and the DeVille was actually unfair. So please stay tuned.
You work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
Okay, welcome back, folks. So, here is why the comparison between the Town Car and the DeVille is actually not an entirely fair comparison. And if you've noticed so far, and you actually know your stuff, you will find out from the very beginning, why did this man compare a Town Car with a DeVille? It's like comparing apples and oranges in a sense. And here's why. The two have never been the same car. They have never even been close. And here's why. The two vehicles, though catering to the same demographic, are fundamentally different. The real competitor to the DeVille would have been the Lincoln Continental of the era. It would have fared a lot better than the Town Car. Here's the philosophy. And not even the philosophy, here's the history behind it. When GM had its direct competitor to the Panther platform, which was the B-body, every single Panther platform car had a GM B-body equivalent. The Ford Crown Victoria, GM's response was the Chevy Caprice. The Mercury Grand Marquis, GM's response was the Buick Roadmaster. The Mercury Colony Park, the station wagon, GM's response was the Buick Roadmaster Estate Wagon. The Lincoln Town Car, GM's response was the Cadillac Fleetwood. 1-in-1, the same, tit for tat. That's how GM competed against the Panther platform up until '96. when they discontinued the B-body in favor for their SUVs, such as the GMC Suburban, which it was actually called the GMC Suburban at the time, but later called the GMC Yukon, and the Cadillac DeVille. Cadillac Escalade. Now, this left a gap in the American car market, in which Lincoln capitalized on that. It left a gap for traditional traditional rear-wheel drive American luxury sedans, body-on-frame construction, used for fleet use. The only reason why they kept the town car in production as far as the other Panther platform cars was because they were so popular. Lincoln, in its mind, was like, hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So they kept on offering the same old-fashioned vehicle because livery companies used them for taxi service, for limousine conversions, for in the case of the Ford Crown Victoria, for cop car use. They used it because it was such a versatile platform, such a well-built car that they just couldn't bear to part with it. Now, this whole podcast so far has made Lincoln out to somehow be some sort of stuffy, out of touch with reality sort of car company. That's not the case. Lincoln saw how the tide was turning and introduced the Continental as a front-wheel drive, unibody construction car to compete directly with the DeVille. So it was GM which really, discontinued their version of the traditional American luxury sedan with the B-body that left, a gap in the market that Ford moved in and capitalized on. Ford had already been better than GM as far as fleet sales go anyway. So now, when that happened, then they just moved in and capitalized on it. And of course, Chrysler is still, playing footsie with the Germans. So they whatever they were doing with the 300, they did it. But Lincoln moved in as the premier fleet vehicle because you couldn't use a DeVille as a fleet vehicle. The reason why the DeVille was not meant for that. The DeVille was not meant for years and years and years of abuse and basic maintenance to keep it on the road. It's not American in its philosophy, fully at least. The real competitor to the DeVille from Lincoln would have been the Lincoln Continental. And here are my specs on the Lincoln Continental that I've managed to scrounge up. The Continental was much more like the DeVille on paper. It had a 4.6-liter dual overhead camshaft Intec V8 that produced 275 horsepower. What else used a dual overhead camshaft V8 that produced 275 horsepower? The Cadillac DeVille. It was absolutely no coincidence whatsoever that the Lincoln Continental produced the same power output as the DeVille to the front wheels with an engine that was engineered exactly the same. At least exactly the same on paper. Probably in practicality a lot more reliable than the North Star. But you have this Intec V8 that's producing 275 horsepower. 0 to 60 was 7.2 seconds. In the Cadillac DTS, it was 7 seconds. Cadillac DeVille DTS, that is. And in the Cadillac DeVille base was 7.9 seconds. So it was actually faster than the DeVille by 0.7 seconds. And it had a lot more modern amenities than the old town car. What had happened, essentially, had become a dichotomy. It's the same thing that was happening with GM back in the 90s. They had two large luxury sedans for sale. You had the Lincoln, or you had the Cadillac Fleetwood and the Cadillac DeVille. One was old-fashioned, one was modern. You could have your pick. You could have the modern DeVille, or you could have the old-fashioned Fleetwood. that still used large chrome bumpers that were attached to the frame of the car because the frame of the car was separate from the body. It was an actual chassis, not a unibody construction. It was rear-wheel drive. It handled like a boat, and it was very heavy. Same thing with the town car. The town car, Lincoln had a dichotomy. 2 large luxury sedans. And at a point, it was 3 large luxury sedans. Because you can get a Continental in sedan form with, I believe, the Continental Mark 6 or Mark 7. And you can get a Lincoln Town Car, and you can get a Lincoln Continental. But the Lincoln Continental wasn't the same as the Continental. The Continental sedan was not the same as the Lincoln Continental. It was not the same as the Town Car. The Continental sedan was built on the same platform as the Town Car, but the Lincoln Continental was built on a front-wheel drive unibody construction platform until they finally dropped the Continental sedan and continued to offer the Continental as a coupe up until the Mark 8 ended in 2002, in which it wasn't even called the Continental Mark 8 to avoid confusion, but it was still the same line of vehicles. So now you have this sort of dichotomy. GM's B-bodies were not as profitable as Lincoln's or as Ford's Panther platforms. So GM got to a point where they're like, you know what? We don't need 2 large luxury sedans. We could just get rid of the Roadmaster, the Fleetwood, and the Caprice. We could get rid of all those vehicles and just have the DeVille, the Park Avenue, and the Impala, respectively. We could get rid of all those vehicles and just have those. And then we could use that factory in Arlington, Texas, where they built the Fleetwood. We could use that to produce the new Cadillac Escalade. And then Lincoln, being very much the stubborn holdouts that they were, they saw no need to discontinue the town car because it was so successful. The Panther platform was so successful. They were like, hey, you know what? Now we have less competition as far as fleet sales go. We can capitalize on this. We can monopolize this market as far as fleet sales go. So what we're going to do, we're going to keep it as a fleet vehicle, and those who know can buy one. But we're not going to even advertise it so much anymore. The car we're going to start advertising is the Lincoln Continental. We're going to start advertising the Lincoln LS. So they advertised the Continental. They advertised the LS. The town car fell in the shadows as far as advertising and marketing went. But it was still bought up because people knew the reliable reputation and the fact that the geriatric population wanted something that reminded them of their cars, of their heyday. Body-on-frame, rear-wheel drive sedans. So there you have it. That's why the comparison is not fair. Lincoln made a car to compete against the DeVille. That was the Continental. The Lincoln Continental that finally went out of production in 2002 was the last Continental. And after that, from 2003 onward, the lines became blurred because Lincoln didn't have really a front-wheel drive sedan that directly replaced the Continental. They tried the LS for a time, but the LS was rear-wheel drive and had horrible reliability issues, blah, blah, blah. And then so they finally came out again with the MKS. And I believe 2007. So there was about a 5-year hiatus as far as front-wheel drive Lincolns go. They came out with the MKS, which was basically a fancied-up Ford Taurus. And then the MKS competed against the DTS of the time period, which was the Cadillac's evolution of the DeVille. So it got the DTS, which was a DeVille touring sedan. The MKS competed against the DTS. And then the town car finally went out of production in 2011 after there was just no space for it anymore. They could have continued to upgrade it, but at that point, they would have had to fundamentally change the car, in which it would have no longer been a town car anyway. So there you have it. That's what truly happened. That's how the cookie crumbled. The town car is not a comparable vehicle to the DeVille. The town car is comparable to the Cadillac Fleetwood. and in which the town car would have obviously been more modern because the town car survived into the 2000s, the Fleetwood did not. And then the Continental was the one that we should truly be looking at when comparing it to the DeVille. I didn't actually find this out until I was doing my research for the podcast on the traditional American luxury sedan, the life and the death of. Yeah, that's what I ended up finding out. And so because I've gone so over time with these podcasts, I've been finding some good information lately and some good material to be doing these podcasts on. Please forgive me for going over time. We're at about, probably after I've done editing and everything, an hour and 15 minutes. So I'm going to save you from the thoughts in the comments. I'll just give you my own personal thoughts. I love both. I would rather own a town car than another DeVille, frankly. Even though, as far as reliability goes, if I'm just going to keep a car just to be pretty and to look at and to drive on the weekends, definitely a DeVille. But yeah. And another thing I should say, reliability is not the main factor in luxury cars. Reliability should never have been, well, actually, that's wrong. Reliability should be a main factor in luxury cars, but that's not the modern interpretation of the luxury car. The modern interpretation of the luxury car, reliability is second to technology, comfort, and performance. There was a time that luxury meant reliability because it was built well. And that's the era that the town car comes from. That's the era that the Fleetwood came from. The DeVille, even though it was born in that era, evolved out of it. And that's why the DeVille was not particularly a reliable vehicle, but I don't think it was meant to be because of the philosophy of how luxury cars ought to be. So thank you for listening to this edition of the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I have been your host, David Lucy Mabel. Thank you so much. Follow us on Instagram because we have an Instagram now. Follow us on Twitter and tell your friends about us. We are available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, and any other place you can find podcasts. So please stay tuned for our next episode, in which I have not decided what it's going to be yet, but it will be up within the next week. Stay tuned, folks, and have a good night. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the GSMC Car Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed today's episode.